Your mind believes it was built for truth, for clarity, logic, order. But hidden beneath that confidence lies a quiet flaw. The brain can stand contradiction, and yet its set's made of nothing else. Every thought you've ever had is a loop. Belief followed by doubt, certainty shadowed by its opposite. The same circuits that search for meaning also create confusion the moment they look too closely. This is the liarcep's paradox, the mind confronting its own reflection and realizing that even truth can lie. Tonight at Neuroscience Academy, we still step inside the loop and feel what happens when reason meets its mirror. The sentence arrives without warning, small enough to fit on a single line. This sentence is false. You read it once, then again, your brain does what it always does. It tries to assign meaning, to categorize, to decide whether something belongs to the box of truth or the box of falsehood. But this time, there is no box that fits. The mind hesitates, suspended between the two. It's a strange kind of vertigo, a logical dizziness. One part of you insists that if the sentence is true, then it must be false. Another part argues that if it's false, then somehow it must also be true. The loop tightens, feeding on itself, a mental snake devouring its own tail. For a moment, your brain falters. The neurons that usually fire in neat patterns begin to cross signals. Activity lights up in regions that detect conflict, as if you've just spotted a contradiction in the physical world. The anterior cingulate cortex, a slender strip deep in the brain's center, becomes active, signaling something's wrong. The prefrontal cortex moves to intervene, searching for resolution. It's the same network that activates when you hear a moral contradiction, like a trusted friend telling a cruel lie. Logic and emotion are suddenly bound together. The liar's paradox is no longer just an idea, it's an experience. Your body reacts, subtly, a tiny rush of stress hormones, a microsecond of uncertainty. The brain was built to find patterns, not endless loops. It needs closure, and when closure is denied, it turns restless. It's like hearing a musical scale that stops one note before resolution. Your mind leans forward, desperate for the final tone that will complete the melody, but the melody never ends. Now imagine your consciousness as a vast control room, dimly lit, with thousands of monitors showing possible meanings and interpretations. When a normal statement enters, the sky is blue, fire is hot, the control room hums with agreement. Systems align, decisions are made, and the mind feels stable. But when the paradox arrives, the room flickers, screens show conflicting data, alarms blink on and off, and no operator can find the override switch. This sentence is false. It's like watching two mirrors face each other. Each reflection shows another, smaller version of itself, and the image repeats into infinity. The paradox creates a feedback loop of meaning, language feeding on language, thought examining thought. This is what philosophers call self-reference, and what neuroscientists see as recursive processing. It's the brain turning its lens inward, reflecting not on the world, but on its own mechanisms. You've just triggered one of the rare moments when your own consciousness observes itself collapsing. There's a strange comfort in that collapse. The impossibility of the sentence reminds you that thought is fragile, that meaning depends on boundaries that are often invisible. The brain's need for consistency is a form of protection. It edits out contradictions to keep you sane. Every day you experience small paradoxes that the mind quickly patches over. You say, "I hate how much I care," or "I'm not myself today." Each of those phrases hides a contradiction that the brain smooths out to preserve coherence. But here, with the liar's paradox, the mind can't hide. The conflict is too pure. When you stare at the sentence long enough, something deeper happens. The logical mind begins to tire, and another part of you takes over, the reflective part, the one that can tolerate ambiguity. It whispers, maybe not every statement needs to be true or false. Maybe the paradox reveals a hidden dimension of meaning, one that can't be captured by binary thought. Your awareness begins to widen. In that widening, the paradox transforms from a problem into a mirror. You start to see your own dualities reflected in it, the part of you that wants control and the part that craves freedom, the desire to speak honestly, and the fear of being misunderstood, the rational mind and the emotional heart, each declaring the other wrong, both somehow right. The paradox doesn't just exist in words, it exists in you. If you could look inside your skull at this very moment, you'd see billions of neurons negotiating this truce. Some fire in support of resolution, find the truth. Others signal surrender. There is none to find. This internal standoff is what gives rise to your awareness of contradiction. Without it, you wouldn't even notice the paradox. The very capacity to feel that something's off is a triumph of higher cognition. The mind creates the problem, and in doing so reveals its own depth. Philosophers often described the liar's paradox as a logical virus, an infection that corrupts any system that tries to define truth absolutely. But perhaps it's not a virus at all. Perhaps it's an evolutionary mirror test for the mind, a moment that forces consciousness to see its own limits. Because when the brain can't decide whether a sentence is true or false, it's not failing, it's discovering that its categories were too small. This is the moment where philosophy begins to blend with neuroscience. The sentence on the page becomes a neural event, a cascade of firing and inhibition, a physical manifestation of logical tension. Your awareness becomes both observer and participant, watching itself try to untangle a knot made of language. So you sit with it. The sentence is false. The sentence is true. The sentence is neither. And somewhere between those shifting poles, you sense a strange stillness, a pause in which truth and falsehood lose their meaning entirely. That pause is important. It's the doorway through which we'll walk next. Because before the paradox was a neurological loop, it was a philosophical one, a riddle whispered across centuries, from the ancient island of Crete to the halls of modern science. And it all began with a man who claimed that everyone from his homeland was a liar. The story begins far before the microscope, before brain scans and data. It starts under the bright, merciless sun of the Aegean Sea. On the island of Crete, in the 6th century before our era, a philosopher named Epimenides spoke a sentence that would echo for thousands of years: "All Cretans are liars." At first, it might have sounded like a jest, an old man's complaint about his people, but the logic hiding within it was poisonous and brilliant. If Epimenides himself was a Cretan, then his claim that all Cretans are liars must also include him. And if he was lying, then perhaps Cretans tell the truth. But if Cretans tell the truth, then his statement becomes true again. The thought folds inward like a wave that never breaks. What Epimenides had unknowingly done was summon the first recorded version of the liar's paradox, and with it he created a doorway between two worlds, one ruled by philosophy and another that would, millennia later, belong to cognitive science. Imagine the scene. A small group of thinkers gather in a shaded courtyard, the air filled with the hum of cicadas and the smell of olive oil and dust. Philosophy was young then, almost childlike, more poetry than logic. The Greeks were obsessed with the question of truth, not as a fact to be measured, but as a living property of the universe. To them, truth was not something one had, but something one aligned with. Epimenides' sentence was an earthquake beneath that belief. If a sentence could both reveal and destroy truth in the same breath, what did that mean for reason itself? In the centuries that followed, other philosophers took up the challenge. The paradox wandered through Athens like a ghost. It reached the ears of Eubulides of Miletus, who refined it into the simple phrase we know today: "This statement is false." A sentence so small it could be carved on a coin, yet dense enough to split the foundations of logic. The brilliance of the paradox is that it exposes something that reason alone cannot contain: self-reference, the mind's ability to point back at itself. This ability is what allows you to reflect, to know that you know. It's the birth of metacognition, the awareness of awareness itself. But with that gift came instability. When a system can describe itself, it can also contradict itself. From the outside, this may seem like abstract philosophy, but deep inside your skull, this ancient puzzle is still alive. Your brain is, in many ways, a living paradox machine. Every moment, it constructs a model of the world, and within that model, it includes a smaller version of you. That smaller you is the one who narrates your life, who says, I think, I feel, I am. But the strange thing is that this model can never fully capture the thing it describes. The observer is trying to grasp the observer. The loop closes and logic trembles. The Greeks did not have the language of neuroscience, but they felt this trembling. They sensed that to think about thought was to risk falling into an infinite regress. For them, the paradox wasn't just an intellectual game, it was a warning. It said, truth cannot exist without contradiction. Consider how that idea must have felt in an age before science. The paradox hinted that reason itself had a flaw, a small crack running through the marble of logic. Yet rather than discard the paradox, the philosophers kept it close. They meditated on it, debated it, wove it into poetry and argument. To them, contradiction was not failure, but mystery, a sign that human thought had reached the edge of what could be understood. And if we look carefully, that attitude still lives in us. When we face problems we can't solve, questions about morality, identity, or meaning, we circle them the way the Greeks circled the paradox. We build new words, new systems, new sciences, but at the center, the loop remains. In your own brain, the same pattern repeats. A question arises, and neurons begin to form a circuit of meaning. One part of the mind makes a statement, another evaluates it. The loop between them defines what you call thinking. Epimenides didn't know it, but his simple phrase was an early sketch of your inner architecture. As we move through history, the paradox will evolve, adopted by logicians, mathematicians, and psychologists. But its core will never change. It's the same human puzzle that sits behind your everyday contradictions. I want change, but I fear it. I crave truth, but I resist it. I love freedom, yet I long for certainty. Each of these statements carries a quiet echo of Epimenides, whispering that the mind cannot live without conflict. And perhaps that's the real lesson the Cretan philosopher gave us. Not that humans lie, but that truth itself is unstable when the observer is part of the equation. As the centuries passed, this insight drifted from the shores of Crete to the grand libraries of Alexandria, through the scrolls of Aristotle, and into the heart of Western thought. By the time it reached the modern age, it had transformed into something both deeper and more measurable. Scientists began to ask, what happens in the brain when we face contradiction itself? They discovered something remarkable. When we encounter logical impossibilities, our brains react the same way they do to emotional conflict. The same neural circuits that help us navigate social tension ignite when we meet paradox. The mind does not separate intellectual and emotional contradiction. It feels both as dissonance. So the liar's paradox, born in the dry wind of an ancient island, has become a map of the modern mind, a bridge between the philosophical and the biological. And as you trace that bridge, another question begins to form. If the brain can create paradox through language, can it also experience it within itself without words? Can your mind in silence contradict itself, not in speech, but in pure thought? That is where we go next, into the landscape of your own brain, where logic meets emotion, and the paradox is no longer just a phrase, but a living process. Your mind is a mirror that knows it is a mirror, that is its gift and its flaw. Every creature on earth perceives the world, but very few can perceive that they are perceiving. The cat watches the bird watches the sky, but only you can watch the act of watching itself. This self-awareness, this ability to turn your attention inward, was the quiet revolution that transformed a simple biological organ into consciousness. Yet with that transformation came something delicate, unstable, and profoundly strange: self-reference. You experience it in small, ordinary moments. You think, I'm thinking too much. You tell yourself, I shouldn't feel guilty for feeling guilty. These are not just poetic turns of phrase, they're neurological loops. In them, one part of your brain produces a statement, and another part becomes its witness. and sometimes both parts speak at once. In neuroscience, this phenomenon arises through recursive processing, the brain's ability to feed its own output back into its input. It's what allows you to imagine your future self, to analyze your motives, or to reflect on the tone of your own voice. Evolution didn't design this system for paradox. It designed it for survival. The ability to model yourself gave you foresight, empathy, and strategy. You could simulate others' minds and predict their behavior. You could adapt, but recursion comes with a cost. The moment a system begins to represent itself, it risks confusion between the symbol and the thing symbolized. The representation can never perfectly capture the original. There's always a residue, a gap. The philosopher Alfred Korzybski once said, "The map is not the territory. Your mind, in this sense, is the ultimate cartographer. It maps the world, and within that map, it draws itself. Yet the self on the map is not the same as the one holding the pen." This slippage, the small distance between you and your image of you, is where paradox enters. When you think about yourself, who exactly is doing the thinking? The observer or the observed? The act of self-reference creates two selves, the thinker and the thought of. Each believes it is the real one. Each speaks with authority, and sometimes their voices overlap. Picture this. You're standing before a tall mirror. For a moment, you simply see yourself, but then the reflection shifts, not physically, but conceptually. You realize that the image staring back is not truly you. It's a translation reversed and flattened by glass. Now imagine that reflection suddenly becoming self-aware. It looks at you and thinks, "I am real, and you are the copy." In that instant, both images, the physical and the mental, collapse into confusion. You and your reflection have entered the same paradox. Your brain performs this invisible dance every second. The default mode network, a constellation of regions stretching from the prefrontal cortex to the posterior cingulate, lights up whenever your thoughts turn inward. It is the seat of introspection, identity, and narrative memory, the machinery of the self. When this network talks to itself, it can produce awe, creativity, even moral reflection. But under certain conditions, the loop tightens too much. The system starts chasing its own tail, and consciousness becomes trapped in self-reference. That's what makes the liar's paradox so disturbing and so fascinating. The brain that hears the sentence, "This statement is false," uses the same neural architecture it uses to reflect on itself. It's as if the paradox hijacks the circuitry of consciousness, turning awareness inward until it collapses under its own recursion. Philosophers once called this the infinite regress of the self. Every time you say "I," a smaller version of you appears inside the statement, an observer behind the observer ad infinitum. Some ancient traditions recognized this intuitively. In Eastern philosophy, meditation often aims to dissolve the observing self, to end the endless recursion of "I am aware that I am aware." When that loop quiets, practitioners report a feeling of boundless stillness, the paradox resolved by surrender. But in Western thought, the loop became an engine for knowledge. Self-reference birthed logic, mathematics, and introspection itself. To understand anything, you had to model not just the world, but your relation to it. And so consciousness evolved into a system that could inspect its own code. This ability has brought extraordinary power and deep vulnerability, because once the mind can observe itself, it can also doubt itself. The same recursion that gives rise to truth can generate contradiction. Your awareness is both the author and the critic of its own story. It writes, then questions the writing, then questions the questioning. It's a perfect circle that never fully closes. And yet, you live within that circle every day. When you deliberate, when you change your mind, when you wonder whether your feelings are justified, you are navigating the paradox of self-reference. The liar's sentence is only a linguistic echo of what your brain does naturally: create meaning through self-contradiction. So perhaps the paradox doesn't begin with language at all. Perhaps language merely revealed something that was already true about consciousness, that to be self-aware is to stand in two places at once. Inside experience, and outside it, watching. That duality is fragile, beautiful, and relentless. It's what allows you to grow, to learn, to change. But it also means you will never fully escape contradiction. To know yourself completely would mean to step outside yourself entirely, and the moment you do, you are no longer the one being known. The Greeks stumbled upon this truth intuitively, and logic would spend centuries trying to contain it. Yet neuroscience now confirms what philosophy only suspected: the self is a loop, not a point. The mind is both the storyteller and the story it tells. And when that loop encounters its own reflection, when thought looks directly into thought, it sparks the impossible question: can a brain built to resolve truth survive contact with something that cannot be resolved? That is where we go next, into the machinery of the brain itself, where logic collides with biology and paradox takes physical form in the dance of neurons. Your brain is a storyteller made of electricity. Each second, billions of neurons pulse and whisper, crafting narratives of cause and effect, weaving meaning from chaos. It is a living engine of interpretation, a biological novelist that cannot bear uncertainty. Every thought you have, every belief you hold, is the brain's attempt to stabilize a moving world into a coherent story. But when a paradox appears, the story fractures. When you read "this sentence is false," the language processing centers in your left hemisphere decode the words easily. There's no confusion yet. Syntax, grammar, and meaning fall neatly into place. But just a heartbeat later, another network, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, your brain's internal referee, steps in to evaluate truth. This region is part of your reasoning circuit, the seat of judgment and logical assessment. It tries to categorize the sentence: true or false, yes or no, 0 or 1. The moment it does, an error signal erupts. The anterior cingulate cortex flashes to life like a warning light. It's the same region that detects conflict when your emotions and decisions don't align. When your heart says go, but your reasoning says stop. The paradox is not merely read, it's felt. Within milliseconds, your mind becomes a stage for contradiction. The prefrontal cortex insists on resolution. The cingulate shouts that resolution is impossible. Beneath them, deeper structures like the insula and amygdala stir, because uncertainty is inherently emotional. Ambiguity triggers vigilance, the same physiological alertness you feel when something doesn't add up in the outside world. The paradox isn't dangerous, but your brain reacts as though it might be. This cascade has a name: cognitive dissonance. It's the neurological discomfort produced when two incompatible ideas demand equal truth. Most of the time, your brain repairs dissonance automatically. It edits, rationalizes, or forgets. You say things like, "it doesn't really matter," or "there must be an explanation." The tension dissolves. But the liar's paradox cannot be repaired. It's a perfect loop, sealed against resolution. The signal keeps bouncing through your neural pathways, and every circuit that tries to fix it only deepens the contradiction. If you could see it unfold on a brain scan, you'd watch the flicker of logic and conflict as a kind of neural echo, waves of activation moving between frontal and parietal lobes, looping endlessly like light trapped between mirrors. Scientists sometimes describe the brain as a prediction machine, constantly updating its models of the world. But paradox is unmodelable. It feeds the machine an equation that has no solution. The brain continues to predict, continues to fail, and the loop continues. Here, logic and biology collide. The paradox exists only in language, but its consequences are physical. You might even notice your breath change slightly as you think about it, or a faint tightening at the temples. The body listens to the brain's confusion. It prepares for a problem it cannot name. And yet within that discomfort lies something extraordinary. The very same circuits that struggle with paradox are the ones that make abstract thought possible. The brain's ability to hold two incompatible ideas simultaneously is also what allows you to imagine, to dream, to empathize. To understand irony or humor, your brain must tolerate inconsistency. It must briefly believe something it knows is false. In this sense, the liar's loop is not an error, it's the price of imagination. Neuroscientists studying creativity often observe a pattern of oscillation between two networks, the default mode network, which generates ideas, and the executive control network, which evaluates them. Creativity is a dialogue between freedom and constraint. One invents, the other judges. The liar's paradox hijacks this dialogue. It activates both networks at once and forces them into an infinite argument. The result feels like frustration to the logical mind, but to the deeper self, it feels strangely alive. Because to exist at all, to be aware, is to stand inside such a loop. Your brain constructs a world, interprets it, then adjusts its own model based on that interpretation. The observer changes the observed, and the observed reshapes the observer. It's the same recursive dance that gives rise to consciousness itself. Now imagine the paradox as a reflection of that deeper rhythm. The statement, "This sentence is false," is not just a riddle, it's a mirror of your brain's architecture. The logic that evaluates truth and the emotion that reacts to contradiction are entangled, inseparable. One half of your mind writes the sentence, the other half tries to erase it. The erasure becomes another sentence, and so on, until the distinction between creation and correction disappears. Philosophically, this is where the boundaries between truth and perception begin to blur. If your brain is designed to produce coherence, how much of what you call truth is simply the absence of dissonance? Does something feel true because it corresponds to reality, or because your neurons can live with it? In laboratory studies, when participants are shown logically impossible statements, their brains exhibit not just cognitive, but emotional responses. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, associated with value and self-relevance, often activates. That means the brain treats contradiction as personal. It doesn't merely analyze. It identifies. The failure of logic feels like a small wound to the self. And so paradox becomes intimate. It reaches past philosophy and touches something primal, the brain's need to trust its own storytelling. When that trust is shaken, the mind reveals its deepest structure, a pattern-seeking, self-correcting, endlessly looping organism that will not rest until the story makes sense, even if it never can. But if the mind cannot break the loop, it can learn to listen to it. Beneath the static of contradiction, there's information, a whisper about how consciousness maintains balance on the edge of chaos. The liar's sentence may be false, but the experience of its falseness is real. That experience teaches the brain what it means to question itself. And that questioning, fragile and eternal, is the birthplace of philosophy. Still, logic resists silence. It wants an answer. Somewhere, deep within the neural storm, your brain begins to ask, can I ever escape this loop? Or must every system that understands truth eventually meet its own contradiction? That question will lead us next into the feeling of paradox, the raw, emotional pulse that runs beneath reasoning. Because what begins as logic always ends as sensation. There is a quiet unease that settles in the mind when something doesn't fit, a small, invisible friction that begins behind your eyes and spreads downward like static running through your chest. You feel it when your beliefs collide, when your behavior contradicts your values, or when the world refuses to match the map inside your head. That sensation, the psychological pressure to reconcile inconsistency, is what modern science calls cognitive dissonance. And though it sounds like an abstract concept, it is as tangible as breath. It's the pulse that quickens when you try to defend something you secretly doubt. It's the ache that comes from saying, I'm fine, when you know you're not. It's the internal tug of war between comfort and truth. In the presence of the liar's paradox, your mind enters this state instantly. You read the sentence, this statement is false, and deep within, your neural machinery splits in two. One circuit, driven by logic, attempts to classify the statement. Another, driven by consistency, insists the world cannot hold contradictions. These two systems begin to compete, and the conflict manifests as discomfort. If we could peer inside your brain at that moment, we would see the anterior cingulate cortex glowing again, its signature pattern of conflict detection. It's the same region that activates when your expectations are violated, when someone you trust betrays you, or when you realize you've made a mistake. Your brain, in essence, treats paradox as a social betrayal committed by logic itself. But it doesn't stop there. The insula, which monitors internal states like heartbeat and gut tension, responds as well. It brings the contradiction into the body. You might feel a subtle flutter, a tightening in the stomach. The dissonance is embodied. It's not just a thought, but a felt imbalance between what should be and what is. Cognitive dissonance is the mind's attempt to return to harmony. Your brain's primary goal is not accuracy, it's equilibrium. When it senses disharmony, it tries to repair it by changing one of the conflicting parts. Sometimes it alters beliefs to fit behavior. Sometimes it changes perception to protect emotion. This silent recalibration happens every day. You tell yourself it wasn't that bad, when deep down you know it was. You rationalize a choice you regret, inventing reasons that didn't exist at the time. You soften the truth until it no longer hurts. Each of these is a small act of self-deception, a gentle anesthetic against dissonance. And in that sense, every human life is filled with small paradoxes, each one a personal version of the liar's sentence, spoken not in language, but in feeling. Scientists once believed that dissonance was purely a mental phenomenon, a glitch in reasoning, but research began to reveal its emotional depth. The same neural circuits that process moral conflict, empathy, and social rejection overlap with those that handle cognitive contradiction. To your brain, inconsistency isn't just illogical, it's unsafe. It threatens the coherence of your identity, the stability of the story you tell about who you are. And so, your mind works tirelessly to avoid it. You filter information, surround yourself with confirming voices, and reinterpret events to keep your worldview intact. This isn't weakness, it's biology. The brain preserves equilibrium because, for most of human history, internal chaos could mean paralysis. In the wild, hesitation was dangerous. Certainty, even if false, kept the body moving. Yet paradoxically, it's this same discomfort that drives growth. Dissonance is the psychological signal that something new is trying to be born. When your existing beliefs cannot contain an experience, tension arises, not to punish you, but to force you to expand your framework. It's the mind's version of evolution. Think of the first time you encountered a truth that contradicted everything you'd been taught. Maybe it was about the world, or love, or yourself. At first, it burned, your neurons firing with confusion and resistance. But with time, the discomfort softened, and a new structure of understanding emerged. What began as pain became clarity. This is the secret beauty of dissonance. It is both destruction and creation. It dismantles certainty, making space for deeper coherence. Your paradox, then, is not your enemy, it's your tutor. It teaches the mind humility, reminding it that truth cannot be forced into tidy boxes. In a sense, every scientific breakthrough begins as cognitive dissonance. Every artist, philosopher, or thinker who has challenged the norms has felt the sting of contradiction first. They hold the tension longer than others, refusing to escape it too quickly. Where most minds rush to relieve the pressure, they remain inside it, listening. Neuroscience suggests that this ability, the tolerance for ambiguity, correlates with creativity and emotional resilience. Those who can endure paradox without immediate resolution exhibit more flexible neural connectivity. Their brains can maintain simultaneous activation in networks that for others might cancel each other out. It's as if the mind learns to breathe inside contradiction. So when you read The Liar's Paradox and feel that subtle pull of discomfort, realize what it represents, the same mechanism that allows you to grow, adapt, and create. The brain is rehearsing its greatest art, the reconciliation of the impossible. And that art extends beyond logic into emotion itself, because while cognitive dissonance describes the conflict between ideas, there is a deeper layer still, a moment when thinking and feeling blur and contradiction becomes sensation rather than structure. That's where we'll go next, into the place where logic transforms into emotion, and the paradox stops being a riddle and becomes a feeling, alive, bodily, and human. It starts subtly, like the dim vibration of a tuning fork deep inside your chest. You're thinking, at least you believe you are, but the longer the thought lingers, the more it begins to feel like something else. A sensation, a mood, a quiet ache that has shape but no name. That is the moment when logic turns emotional, when the architecture of reason dissolves into the chemistry of feeling. The liar's paradox does this to you. At first, it seems like an intellectual riddle, just words, but the longer your brain wrestles with it, the more it begins to engage systems that have nothing to do with logic. A paradox is not only thought about, it is felt, because every contradiction, no matter how abstract, is experienced as a threat to stability, and stability is emotional currency for the mind. Inside your skull, the circuits of logic and emotion are neighbors. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which integrates reasoning with feeling, acts like a bridge between them. When a paradox presents itself, this region lights up, just as it does when you weigh moral dilemmas, feel guilt, or empathize with another person's pain. The liar's paradox is, in a sense, a moral puzzle, with no resolution. Your reasoning demands consistency, but your body demands peace. Neither can win. As the loop continues, chemistry begins to take over. The amygdala, guardian of threat detection, becomes active, not because danger is present, but because uncertainty is, ambiguity is its own kind of fear. To your nervous system, unresolved information feels like standing in the dark, waiting for something to emerge. Adrenaline trickles. Microtensions rise in the shoulders and throat. Even if you don't notice, your body leans forward slightly, trying to anticipate what comes next. This is how emotion and logic become indistinguishable. What begins as a question of truth becomes a feeling of unease, curiosity, or even wonder. The paradox becomes alive within you, not as a sentence, but as a state. To understand why, imagine the mind as a musician with two instruments. One plays language, reason, analysis. The other plays rhythm, tone, sensation. Most of the time, they harmonize. Logic gives structure to emotion. Emotion gives color to logic. But when you encounter a contradiction that cannot be resolved, the two instruments fall out of sync. The melody fractures into dissonance. You can hear both at once, but they no longer share a key. And yet, even this discord has purpose. The human brain is not built to eliminate emotion from thought, it's built to integrate it. Emotion acts as a guidepost, telling logic what matters. Without emotional valuation, thought has no direction. It becomes sterile, unanchored, a machine spinning without friction. The paradox shows this vividly. When truth collapses, feeling rushes in to fill the void. That's why you can sense something profound, even in a simple contradiction. It's why you can feel awe in confusion, beauty in uncertainty. The same neural circuits that respond to paradox overlap with those activated by music, poetry, and art. The brain finds pleasure in patterns that almost resolve, but never quite do. The incomplete cadence, the suspended chord, the unfinished thought, they all mirror the structure of the liar's paradox. You are wired to find meaning in the tension between resolution and release. Think about the times you've argued with yourself. One part of you insists you should leave. Another begs you to stay. Both seem right. The emotional turbulence that follows is not an accident. It's the same logic-emotion interface playing out at full volume. You are both the statement and its negation, both truth and falsehood embodied. And when you finally make a choice, what you call intuition is really the integration of logic and emotion, a decision born from paradox that the body resolved in its own way. There's something humbling about realizing that feeling is not separate from thinking. It's the shadow that thought casts upon the body. Every rational conclusion carries an emotional signature, a biochemical echo that tells your nervous system whether it agrees. When logic finds no ground, the emotion that follows confusion, wonder, irritation, is the mind's way of saying, I have reached the limits of understanding, and yet You don't turn away. You keep thinking, keep feeling, as though the paradox has become magnetic. The more you fail to solve it, the more you're drawn to it. That attraction is deeply human. It's the same pull that drives scientists toward mysteries, lovers toward uncertainty, and dreamers toward the impossible. Your brain, it turns out, is not built to avoid contradiction. It's built to chase it. Because contradiction creates emotion, and emotion creates meaning. Without that tension, consciousness would flatten into repetition. The paradox gives it texture, tone, and pulse. Philosophers once believed that emotion corrupted reason, that the two were enemies in the pursuit of truth. But neuroscience now reveals a subtler picture. Emotion is reason's compass. Remove it, and logic becomes unmoored. Patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex often retain intelligence and reasoning, yet struggle to make even simple decisions. Without emotion, everything feels equally true, and therefore meaningless. So the paradox is not an error in the system. It's a necessary test of integration. It shows you how the rational and the emotional mind depend on each other. The friction you feel is the sound of those two voices learning to listen. And perhaps, in that uneasy harmony, something deeper is revealed, that truth is not a single tone, but a chord, sometimes discordant, always alive. As you linger in that awareness, the logical and emotional begin to blend, until you can no longer tell which is which. The paradox becomes less about truth and more about coherence, less about solving, more about sensing. And just when you think you've adapted to that balance, another layer emerges. The mind, it seems, will not stop protecting its internal order. When contradiction becomes unbearable, it rewrites the story altogether. That silent act, the rewriting of truth to protect the self, is where we turn next. It's the illusion that keeps your reality from collapsing under its own contradictions, the brain's remarkable and sometimes deceptive talent for coherence. The human mind does not crave truth as much as it craves coherence. Truth can be painful, chaotic, or incomplete. Coherence, on the other hand, feels like peace. It is the sense that things fit together, that the world behaves as it should, that your story makes sense. The brain will bend reality to preserve that feeling, and it will do so quietly you may never notice. Inside your skull, billions of neurons are constantly constructing a model of the world. This model isn't a mirror, it's a story, a living, predictive simulation. Every sound you hear, every emotion you feel, every idea you form passes through this invisible narrative filter. Your brain fills gaps, edits inconsistencies, smooths transitions. It does not show you what is, but what makes sense. The liar's paradox is a direct assault on this process. This sentence is false. The words fit grammar's rules, but not logic's. The brain reads it, processes it, and finds nothing to anchor to. It's like trying to build a bridge over a canyon that has no opposite edge. The result is cognitive vertigo, a momentary failure of coherence. To escape that discomfort, your brain starts doing what it always does. It invents explanations. It may temporarily decide that the sentence is meaningless, or treat it as a joke, or dismiss it as irrelevant. It manufactures a context to dissolve the contradiction. This isn't dishonesty, it's survival. The same neural mechanisms that protect you from confusion in paradox also shield you from pain in life. You can observe this tendency everywhere. You remember conversations differently from how they happened, not because memory fails, but because your brain reconstructs events to maintain emotional order. You reinterpret rejection as destiny, mistakes as lessons, coincidences as signs. The story must continue, and it must feel consistent. Neuroscientists call this the narrative coherence system, and it relies heavily on the default mode network, the same regions that create your sense of self. The mind constructs identity the same way it constructs meaning by editing. It selects fragments of experience that align with its internal logic and discards the rest. Every memory you have is, in a small way, a forgery, accurate enough to convince you, but stylized enough to comfort you. If this sounds deceitful, remember that it's not a flaw, it's a feature. Without this illusion of coherence, you would be overwhelmed. Your senses deliver an impossible flood of data every second, and your emotions often contradict one another. The mind's smoothing mechanisms are what allow you to function, to wake up and believe that the world you left yesterday is the same one you enter today. But paradoxes like the liars expose the fragility of this illusion. They pull at the seams of narrative, revealing how desperate the mind is to protect its sense of order. When confronted with a contradiction that cannot be resolved, the brain often defaults to avoidance. You might feel your attention slip away, a faint irritation, a mental shrug. That's the coherence system quietly closing the file, labeling it unsolvable. Yet beneath that dismissal lies a subtle insight. Every truth you hold rests on this invisible scaffolding of belief and narrative. What you call reality is not purely objective. It's a construction built to minimize contradiction. The liar's paradox is not merely a linguistic trick. It's a small window into the machinery that maintains your sense of truth itself. Think of your consciousness as a painter restoring a cracked fresco. The cracks represent contradiction, gaps in knowledge, inconsistencies, conflicts. Each time one appears, the painter fills it, smooths it, repaints the missing image. From a distance, the mural looks complete, but beneath the surface, it's a patchwork of improvisations and guesses, endlessly retouched. When coherence becomes more important than accuracy, the brain can wander into dangerous territory. Entire belief systems can form around the avoidance of contradiction. People cling to certainties that simplify complexity, ignore data that challenges identity, and defend ideas that provide emotional comfort. The illusion of coherence becomes not just personal, it becomes cultural. Civilizations, too, rewrite paradox into story. But paradox has a quiet, redemptive power. It refuses to be painted over. It reappears through the cracks, whispering that perhaps truth does not live in coherence alone. It reminds the mind that understanding is not the same as peace, and that the tension between them is where real awareness grows. In neuroscience, this tension has a counterpart, the prediction error. Every moment, your brain predicts what will happen next based on prior experience. When reality doesn't match the prediction, a small electrical burst signals the need for revision. The greater the mismatch, the greater the discomfort. Paradox is the ultimate prediction error, a pattern that can't be updated because it contradicts itself. It's a mirror that shows your brain what happens when its narrative machinery meets infinity. So you stand between two impulses. One part of you longs for coherence, the relief of a complete story. The other is drawn to paradox, the thrill of mystery, the hum of complexity. Between them lies awareness itself, flickering. The illusion of coherence isn't something to destroy, it's something to understand. You need its stability to navigate the world, just as you need contradiction to evolve beyond it. The brain's task is not to eliminate paradox, but to hold it gently, like a fragile truth that must remain partly unsolved. And once you begin to see coherence as an illusion, something strange happens. The world around you starts to shimmer slightly. You notice that even your most certain thoughts carry a shadow of uncertainty behind them. Language begins to feel softer, less like a cage and more like a veil. Because if coherence can be manufactured, then so can its opposite. The next step in this journey is to look at the very tool that built these illusions. The instrument through which the paradox first spoke, language. Words, it turns out, are the mind's most beautiful trick and its most dangerous trap. Language is the mind's most brilliant invention and its most deceptive mirror. It builds bridges across silence, connects brains across centuries, and yet it is also where thought most easily loses itself. For within words lie hidden traps, loops, ambiguities, and paradoxes so subtle that even the most precise logic collapses under their weight. Every sentence you speak is an act of translation. Your thoughts, complex, fluid, alive, must squeeze through the narrow gate of grammar and sound. Something is always lost in that passage, something untranslatable. Language, for all its power, is not truth itself. It's a map drawn by the nervous system, full of symbols pointing toward meanings that no symbol can fully contain. The liar's paradox is what happens when that map tries to describe itself. This sentence is false. The statement is self-referential, the map pointing at its own outline, the mirror reflecting the act of reflection. Logic falters because language by its very nature isn't designed to sustain infinite self-reference. Words gain their meaning through contrast, true against false, light against dark, but the paradox collapses those contrasts into one. The result is linguistic vertigo. Inside your brain, this is more than a linguistic puzzle. The left inferior frontal gyrus, known for its role in syntax and semantics, lights up when you process paradoxical language, yet instead of moving neatly from understanding to meaning, the signal loops back on itself. Other regions join in. The temporal cortex struggles to anchor the words in narrative. The prefrontal cortex searches for logical consistency. You can almost sense the system stalling, the rhythm of comprehension hesitating mid-beat. It's the mental equivalent of a computer freezing, language generating an input that the brain cannot execute. But unlike a computer, your mind doesn't crash, it improvises. The right hemisphere, the seat of metaphor and association, begins to assist. It tries to transform the literal contradiction into something poetic, tolerable, or symbolic. The brain saves itself by turning confusion into creativity. This is one of language's most extraordinary qualities. It can fail logically, yet succeed emotionally. You can't solve. This sentence is false, but you can feel what it means. It evokes contradiction, tension, humor, even awe. In that moment, the rational boundary of language dissolves into something more musical, like a chord that refuses to resolve. The paradox becomes art. Every culture, at some level, has known this. Mystics and poets have long used paradoxical language to reach what lies beyond reason. Zen koans, short, contradictory riddles like "what is the sound of one hand clapping?" aren't meant to be solved. They are linguistic mirrors designed to exhaust logic until the mind falls silent. The paradox becomes a doorway, and through it, awareness steps into something wider than words. Science, too, recognizes this threshold. In the study of consciousness, researchers often confront what they call the hard problem, explaining how physical processes give rise to subjective experience. It's a question that, when turned inward, how does matter know itself, begins to resemble the liar's paradox. Language cannot describe the observer without also being the observer. The same infinite regress appears, like a Mobius strip folding thought back onto itself. Philosophically, this is the cost of naming. To name something is to separate it from everything else. The word tree isolates one living form from the forest. The word I isolates you from the world that sustains you. But what if that separation is itself an illusion created by language? The moment you try to say what you are, you have already divided yourself from yourself. Even the structure of language reveals this split. Every sentence requires a subject and a predicate, a doer and a thing done. I think, I believe, I exist. But consciousness doesn't actually function in that sequence. Thought and thinker arise together, intertwined. The grammar of experience is simultaneous, not linear. And yet, language demands division. So every time you speak, you create a small paradox, a self that acts upon itself. This is why language feels both intimate and alien. It is yours, but it shapes you as much as you shape it. The words you use become the boundaries of what you can imagine. A language that lacks a word for contradiction can barely perceive paradox at all. Likewise, the paradoxes you can name define the edges of your own awareness. Modern cognitive linguistics shows that even our most abstract concepts are grounded in metaphor. You say, I see what you mean, not because thought is sight, but because your brain maps vision onto understanding. These metaphors are shortcuts, neural pathways that make thought tangible, but they also trap you within the metaphors themselves. You begin to think that knowing is seeing, that time flows, that minds are containers for thoughts. When language becomes invisible, you start mistaking metaphor for reality. The liar's paradox exposes the limits of that system. It's not just a sentence that contradicts itself, it's a sentence that reveals how fragile meaning becomes when language turns inward. The words stop referring to the world and start referring to themselves, collapsing in a recursive spiral. And yet, somewhere in that collapse lies a strange kind of beauty. The paradox demonstrates that language is alive, dynamic, and self-aware. It shows that thought can fold upon itself, that meaning can be both impossible and luminous. Like light caught between mirrors, it multiplies endlessly, creating depth from nothing but reflection. This is perhaps why paradox feels spiritual to some and threatening to others. It touches the boundary where logic and mystery meet, the seam between mind and the infinite. Language was meant to describe reality, but in paradox, it stumbles into the realization that it is reality speaking to itself. So when your brain meets the liar's paradox, it's not just processing a sentence, it's confronting the very architecture of meaning. It's the linguistic equivalent of consciousness seeing its own face for the first time. But language does not act alone. Behind every word, another force is at work, a silent evaluator that decides what's true, what's false, and what cannot be known. The mind may invent language, but it also judges it. And that brings us to the next question. When your thoughts contradict themselves, who inside you decides which voice to believe? Inside the cathedral of your mind, there is a quiet judge, a presence that listens to every word, every thought, and quietly decides what is real. It doesn't speak aloud, yet its verdicts shape everything you believe. You feel it when you second-guess a decision, when you weigh a memory for truth, when you whisper to yourself, "That can't be right." This inner arbiter is the brain's most intricate creation, the fusion of logic and introspection that allows consciousness to monitor itself. Scientists call it metacognition, the ability to think about thinking. It is a faculty rooted in the prefrontal cortex, the forwardmost region of the brain, where abstract reasoning, planning, and self-evaluation converge. It is here that your internal judge resides, tirelessly assessing the coherence of your mental world. When you consider a statement, any statement, it is this part of your brain that tests it against prior knowledge, emotion, and intuition. When the statement is simple, fire is hot, water flows downward, the judgment is instantaneous, clean, neural patterns align, and the decision feels solid. But when the mind encounters a paradox, that system begins to tremble. The judge is forced into a double bind. Both verdicts, true and false, carry equal weight. To accept one invalidates the other. To reject both invalidates reason itself. The courtroom of thought becomes silent, suspended between verdicts. Imagine the scene inside the prefrontal cortex. Stern, deliberate, stands at the bench. The anterior cingulate cortex, ever sensitive to conflict, raises its objection. "Your Honor, the evidence contradicts itself." The temporal lobes murmur, struggling to match meaning to pattern. And somewhere deep in the limbic system, emotion rises like a restless witness, insisting that certainty must be restored. But the paradox cannot be resolved through reason alone. It exposes something fundamental about the mind, that the very act of judgment depends on contrast. You can only call something true because something else can be false. Yet in the liar's paradox, those categories collapse. The internal judge loses its footing, and for a moment the architecture of truth itself flickers. Your brain does not enjoy this flicker. Stability is its default language. It craves boundaries and verdicts, and so the judge begins to improvise. It may quietly dismiss the problem as nonsensical, file it under irrelevant, or reframe it as metaphor. Sometimes it even delegates the paradox to emotion, transforming confusion into curiosity or awe. This is how the mind survives contradiction, by translating it into something livable. But if you listen closely, you can sense the deeper struggle beneath those mental strategies. It's the same struggle that defines human consciousness, the need to feel certain in a world that resists certainty. Every belief you hold has passed through the court of your prefrontal cortex, weighed not only for evidence, but for how it fits your identity. Your inner judge doesn't just measure logic, it measures belonging, safety, and coherence. That's why doubt feels so personal. When you question something fundamental, your values, your memories, your purpose, the discomfort is not merely intellectual. It's as though the floor beneath your identity begins to tilt. The neural systems that maintain self-consistency flicker, and your mind rushes to correct the imbalance. The liar's paradox, though abstract, taps into this very mechanism. It provokes the same circuitry that governs moral reasoning and emotional self-assessment. Consider how quickly your inner judge delivers its verdicts in daily life. You see a friend frown and instantly decide whether it means anger or fatigue. You hear a rumor and feel the need to accept or reject it within seconds. These judgments aren't slow, deliberate acts. They're reflexes. The brain evolved to make them swiftly because indecision can be dangerous. In the wilderness, hesitation might mean death. In the modern world, it simply means discomfort. And yet, some part of you knows that truth cannot always be rushed. There are moments when the judge must step back, set down the gavel, and allow contradiction to speak for itself. This ability to suspend judgment without collapsing into confusion is a mark of higher cognition. It requires not just logic, but tolerance, humility, and patience. When you practice this suspension, when you let uncertainty breathe, something remarkable happens inside your brain. Activity in the prefrontal cortex softens. The rigid circuits of decision-making relax, and slower networks begin to engage. The posterior cingulate associated with introspection, the insular with bodily awareness. The whole system shifts from verdict to observation. Instead of declaring truth, your mind begins to witness it. This witnessing is the beginning of wisdom. It's what allows philosophers, scientists, and artists to hold paradox without fear, to recognize that contradiction isn't the enemy of truth, but its texture. The judge inside learns to listen rather than rule, to see ambiguity not as weakness, but as evidence of depth. Perhaps this is what consciousness is truly doing all the time, judging itself, doubting itself, learning from its own uncertainty. Your thoughts pass through invisible trials, and in every verdict, your sense of self is refined. The paradox, then, is not a disruption of that process, but its revelation, a glimpse of the judge's own limitations. When you realize this, something shifts. The courtroom inside grows quieter. You begin to understand that your internal judge, for all its intelligence, is not the final authority. It is part of a larger system, a symphony of emotion, perception, and reflection. And that symphony will soon meet its greatest challenge. Because the liar's paradox didn't stop with ancient philosophers or your inner mind, it ignited wars of thought across centuries. Entire philosophies and mathematical systems were built to save logic from collapsing under its own contradictions. Our next step takes us there, to the battleground of the intellect itself, where the brightest minds of history tried to cage the impossible. The liar's paradox did not fade quietly into the dusty scrolls of ancient Greece. It survived, restless, migrating across centuries like a contagion of thought. Every generation of philosophers found it waiting, small, stubborn, and indestructible. It was a sentence so simple that no one could ignore it, and yet so poisonous that anyone who touched it found their theories trembling. Picture a long hall lined with thinkers across time. Aristotle with his methodical calm, medieval logicians cloaked in candlelight, Enlightenment scholars scribbling by lamplight, and mathematicians of the modern age staring at blackboards that seem to loop back on themselves. Each, in their own way, has tried to rescue truth from paradox. Aristotle was one of the first to take up the challenge. In his metaphysics, he proposed what seemed like a firm foundation, the law of non-contradiction, that a thing cannot be both true and false at the same time and in the same respect. To him, this was not a mere rule of logic. It was the backbone of reality itself. If a statement could be both true and false, thought would collapse, and with it, all knowledge. And yet, even as he wrote those words, the liar's paradox lingered like a shadow at the edge of the page. Aristotle dismissed it as a linguistic trick, a confusion of categories, something outside the proper realm of philosophy. But in truth, he had only fenced it in, not defeated it. The paradox waited, patient and smiling, for the next challenger. Centuries later, the problem re-emerged in the medieval universities of Europe. Scholars of logic and theology, men like Thomas Aquinas, William of Ockham, and John Buridan, inherited a world where truth was divine, anchored in God's perfection. But what, they asked, if God himself spoke a paradox? Could an omniscient being utter a sentence that contradicted itself? If he said, "I lie," would it be falsehood, or an infinite truth beyond human understanding? The paradox had slipped from language into theology, from grammar into metaphysics. Theologians tried to contain it by separating kinds of truth. Some truths, they said, belong to the human realm, subject to contradiction. Others belong to the divine, where opposites might coexist without error. It was an elegant attempt to protect reason without limiting God, but it revealed something profound, that even faith must wrestle with paradox, because to speak of infinity is already to exceed the limits of logic. Then came the Renaissance, when language and reason were reborn. The paradox took on new life in the hands of logicians and mathematicians who sought to formalize truth itself. The philosopher René Descartes declared, "I think, therefore I am," a sentence of perfect self-reference, echoing the same looping structure that haunted Epimenides. It was not a contradiction, but it came close, thought proving existence through its own act of awareness. Descartes had tamed self-reference, turning paradox into foundation. But again, the liar's ghost remained, whispering that even the most certain "I am" depends on a sentence that might deceive. By the 19th century, the paradox had migrated fully into logic's new frontier, mathematics. Philosophers like Frege, Russell, and Tarski no longer treated it as a curiosity, but as a crisis. The discovery of paradoxes within formal logic threatened to unravel the entire project of modern rationality. If a simple sentence could defeat truth, what of the systems built upon it, numbers, proofs, reason itself? Bertrand Russell encountered a cousin of the liar's paradox while working on set theory. He asked, can there be a set of all sets that do not contain themselves? If such a set exists, it both must and must not contain itself. It was the mathematical form of "this sentence is false." The contradiction wasn't poetic, it was structural, infecting the very logic that underpinned mathematics. Russell's realization shook the intellectual world. Logic, which had been humanity's purest tool for certainty, was now infected by paradox. To save it, he proposed the theory of types, a hierarchy that would prevent self-reference by forbidding sentences from speaking about themselves. It worked, temporarily, but it came at a cost, a loss of expressive power. Logic could be consistent or complete, but perhaps never both. Through each of these battles, the paradox changed form, but not nature. It adapted like an idea that refuses extinction, exposing the fragile boundary between language and truth. And in doing so, it revealed a deep pattern. Every attempt to eliminate paradox only drives it deeper into the foundation of thought. Even in the modern era, with quantum mechanics blurring the edges of reality and computers calculating truth at light speed, the paradox remains. It has become both symbol and teacher, a reminder that knowledge itself has borders. What these centuries of struggle suggest is something almost mystical, that contradiction might not be the failure of logic, but its origin. Every new system of reasoning begins as a response to paradox. Each time the mind meets what it cannot reconcile, it builds new tools, new languages, new frameworks. The liar's paradox, then, is not an obstacle in the road of thought. It is the road itself. And yet, as history shows, every solution has its price. To restore order, logic must amputate a piece of itself. Russell's hierarchy silenced self-reference. Aristotle's laws banned contradiction. The cost of coherence was always complexity. But one philosopher refused to let the paradox be exiled. He believed that truth itself could be rescued, not by denying self-reference, but by giving it structure. His name was Alfred Tarski, and his proposal, the hierarchy of languages, would become one of the most daring attempts ever made to contain the infinite mirror. Next, we descend into his world, a place where words can speak about words, and truth must climb a ladder to reach itself. Truth, Tarski believed, could be saved, but only if it learned to climb. In the early 20th century, Alfred Tarski stared at the same paradox that had haunted thinkers for 2 millennia. This sentence is false. He saw that no matter how carefully philosophers had constructed their systems, the problem always began at the same point: language trying to swallow its own tail, words speaking about words, statements judging themselves. The paradox, he realized, wasn't a flaw in reasoning, it was a confusion between levels of description. So he built a ladder. Tarski's idea was simple in structure, profound in consequence. He divided the world of language into 2 layers: the object language, which speaks about the world, and the meta-language, which speaks about the first. In this design, a statement in the object language could be true or false, but the truth of that statement could only be discussed in the higher meta-language. No sentence, therefore, could ever declare its own falsehood. The trap of self-reference was sealed off. It was, at last, a clean solution. To understand it, imagine standing in front of a mirror. You see your reflection, your object image, but you cannot step inside that mirror to touch yourself from within. You can only describe what you see from outside. Tarski's ladder preserves this boundary. Truth, he said, belongs to the viewer outside the mirror, not the reflection within it. The beauty of his insight was in its humility. Rather than declaring paradox an illusion, he accepted it as a signal that language had overstepped its domain. A sentence like "snow is white" could be true within the object language, but this sentence is false, had no proper place. It tried to exist in both layers at once, breaking the hierarchy. By restoring separation, Tarski preserved logic's integrity. But every wall comes with a shadow. The moment Tarski raised his ladder, philosophers noticed what it implied: truth could never again be complete within a single system. To speak about truth, you always needed a higher level of language, a wider vantage point, and if you climbed to that higher level, you would eventually find yourself asking the same question: what guarantees the truth of this meta-language? The ladder had no top. For every system, there existed another above it. The climb was infinite. The paradox had not been destroyed, it had been transformed into an architecture of ascent. In Tarski's mind, this was not failure, but revelation. The human mind, he suggested, cannot describe its own totality. Each time it tries, it creates a higher mirror to explain the last. Logic, like consciousness, is recursive, forever reflecting, never complete. You can feel this recursion in your own thoughts. When you judge your emotions, you step into a meta-level of awareness. I'm angry, you say. Then, I shouldn't be angry. And perhaps later, I'm judging myself for being angry. Each layer feels more refined, more self-aware, but also more distant from simplicity. Then there is no final vantage point, only the ongoing act of climbing, one layer of reflection atop another. In neuroscience, this recursive layering appears not just metaphorically, but physically. Brain imaging shows that metacognition, thinking about thought, activates higher cortical areas that monitor the activity of lower ones. The prefrontal cortex observes patterns in deeper emotional and perceptual networks, constantly evaluating them. Your mind in this way is structured like Tarski's ladder, each tier watching the one below, each unable to see itself completely. But as with Tarski's system, the climb never ends. You can notice your thoughts, then notice yourself noticing them, and so on into a quiet infinity. Eventually, awareness itself becomes the object. What, then, stands above the highest rung? What language could describe consciousness, describing consciousness? Tarski's hierarchy was both an intellectual triumph and a subtle surrender. It acknowledged that no definition of truth could ever be fully self-contained. There would always be an outside that the inside could not explain. Truth, in this sense, is not an object. It is a relationship stretching endlessly outward. Yet even this elegant ladder could not escape the paradox's gravity. To define truth at all, one must already assume some concept of truth in the meta-language. And so, the ghost of self-reference remains, quiet, invisible, but alive. It whispers that every definition stands upon another, every explanation floats upon a deeper mystery. For a while, philosophers felt secure on Tarski's rungs. Logic had boundaries again. The paradox was quarantined, but deep below, another thinker was watching. One who would prove that even ladders can fold back on themselves. His name was Gödel, and he would turn Tarski's insight inside out. Gödel's idea was breathtakingly audacious. What if you could take a logical system and make it talk about itself, not by accident, but by design? What if mathematics could encode self-reference in numbers, allowing arithmetic to declare truths about its own structure? The result would shake the foundation of reason itself, because Gödel would discover that every system capable of describing its own logic contains a statement that says, in essence, this statement cannot be proven true. A new paradox had been born, one not of words, but of numbers. The liar's paradox had migrated into mathematics, and the mirror had deepened once more. Imagine standing before a tower made of glass and logic. It stretches upward, layer upon layer, each floor supporting the one above. Every level has rules, strict, beautiful, and precise. Down at the base, simple truths hold everything steady. 1 + 1 = 2. A circle has no corners, but as you climb higher, you realize something unsettling. The glass begins to tremble. Each layer must be perfectly balanced, for if one collapses, the entire structure shatters. This was Bertrand Russell's creation, a tower meant to save mathematics from paradox. At the dawn of the 20th century, Russell and his collaborator, Alfred North Whitehead, sought to build an unshakable foundation for all of logic. Their project, Principia Mathematica, aimed to show that every truth in mathematics could be derived from a consistent set of rules. Numbers, they believed, were not mysteries of the universe, but consequences of logic itself. If they could formalize this structure, reason would finally rest on solid ground. But just as the tower began to rise, a crack appeared, small at first, but widening with each equation. It was discovered not in arithmetic or geometry, but in the abstract realm of sets. A set is a collection of things, apples in a basket, stars in the sky, numbers on a page. Russell asked a simple question: could there exist a set of all sets that do not contain themselves? If it did contain itself, then it didn't belong to the group it was supposed to describe. But if it didn't contain itself, then by definition it should. The paradox was perfect, merciless. It mirrored the liar's sentence. This statement is false in mathematical form. And like that sentence, it produced an infinite loop. Russell realized, horrified, that this self-reference infected the very language of logic. Without intervention, the tower would crumble before it reached its first floor. So he proposed a cure, the theory of types. His solution was architectural. If self-reference created collapse, then it must be forbidden. He divided all expressions into hierarchical types. Lower types, simple statements about numbers or objects, could not speak about higher types, which described statements themselves. In essence, no statement was allowed to talk about its own kind. The mirror was broken, the loop sealed. It was a magnificent repair, elegant in concept. Each type existed safely above the last, immune to self-reflection. A statement about a number lived one floor lower than a statement about statements. The tower could now rise again, seemingly stable. But Russell's tower was fragile, and he knew it. By forbidding self-reference, he had protected logic from collapse, but he had also stripped it of one of its deepest powers, reflection. To prevent paradox, he had caged language itself. The system became orderly but sterile. It could no longer look inward, no longer describe its own architecture. Logic, once alive with recursion, became linear and limited. Russell's hierarchy worked, but only in theory. Mathematicians soon realized that it was almost impossible to use in practice. The rules were too rigid, the separations too severe. Each time someone tried to apply them, new inconsistencies appeared, not paradoxes of contradiction, but paradoxes of omission. The system could no longer express truths that depended on self-reference, truths about truth itself. And so the very idea that had saved logic now began to suffocate it. The tower stood, but it could no longer grow. Its perfection had become its prison. This fragility is not unique to mathematics. It mirrors the human mind. You, too, build hierarchies within yourself, layers of thought, belief, and reflection. You create rules about what you can think, what you can feel, what you are allowed to question. These boundaries keep you coherent, but they also constrain your awareness. You protect your inner order by banishing contradiction, but in doing so you exile mystery, the very force that makes consciousness expand. In neuroscience, the same principle unfolds in the dialogue between brain regions. The prefrontal cortex acts as a regulator, suppressing impulses and enforcing rules. It's the mind's internal theory of types, keeping primal emotions from overruling logic. But when this control becomes too rigid, creativity and emotional fluidity decline. The system is safe, but it stops evolving. Russell's tower, then, is more than a structure of logic. It's a metaphor for every human attempt to perfect the self. Each time you build a hierarchy to protect yourself from contradiction, you risk becoming too stable to grow. The paradox that threatens to destroy you is also the one that keeps you alive. Still, for a brief moment in history, the tower held. Logic seemed saved. The paradox was contained behind the glass walls of Russell's types, and truth once again felt reachable. But beneath the calm surface, another mind was already at work, quiet, meticulous, and revolutionary. Kurt Gödel looked at Russell's architecture and saw its hidden weakness. He saw that even in its careful hierarchy, logic still whispered to itself. It was still, in some secret way, self-aware, and he wondered what would happen if that awareness were expressed not in words but in numbers. In 1931, Gödel published his answer, a proof so beautiful and devastating that it changed the course of philosophy and mathematics forever. He showed that Russell's tower could never be complete. No matter how many flaws logic built, there would always be truths that lived beyond its reach. It was the ultimate irony. The attempt to banish paradox had only ensured its immortality. And so the story of the liar's paradox continued. Now wearing the robes of arithmetic and the language of proof, the next chapter would reveal that contradiction wasn't an error to be fixed, but a window into the infinite nature of truth itself. Imagine that mathematics, so austere, so certain, suddenly discovered its own reflection, a reflection that whispered, "You cannot know everything about yourself." That was the moment when the mirror deepened beyond all return. It was 1931. A quiet, unassuming young mathematician named Kurt Gödel published a paper that would dismantle the dream of perfect logic. His idea was not flamboyant. It didn't shout. It unfolded with the calm inevitability of a sunrise, revealing an endless horizon. And yet, by the time he finished, every structure of absolute truth that humans had built, from Aristotle's syllogisms to Russell's type theory, stood trembling. Gödel's genius was to take the paradox that haunted philosophy and encode it directly into mathematics. Where Epimenides had said, "All Cretans are liars," and a liar's sentence had said, "This statement is false," Gödel's creation would say, in the language of numbers, "This statement cannot be proven true." It was not poetry, it was arithmetic. To do it, Gödel devised a way to make mathematics talk about itself. He assigned every symbol, formula, and proof a unique number, a process now called Gödel numbering. With this, he transformed statements about logic into statements about integers. Suddenly, math could describe not just quantities, but the very act of proving. Arithmetic had become self-aware. From there he constructed a sentence, painstakingly, elegantly, that referred to itself indirectly through this numerical code. The sentence effectively said, "I am unprovable within this system." If the system proved the sentence, it would be inconsistent, because it would have proven a statement that claimed it could not be proven. But if the system could not prove it, then the sentence was true, because it was, in fact, unprovable. Either way, The system was incomplete. The paradox had found its perfect mathematical form. Gödel's incompleteness theorem revealed that any sufficiently powerful logical system, anything capable of expressing arithmetic, contains true statements that cannot be proven within it. In other words, no system can ever be both consistent and complete. There will always be truths that lie beyond its reach, like stars visible through the cracks of a cathedral ceiling. The effect was seismic. The dream that Russell and Whitehead had nurtured to build a flawless tower of logic reaching to the heavens was over. Logic itself, it seemed, carried the seed of its own limits. Even mathematics, the purest of all human languages, could not escape the whisper of contradiction. But what Gödel had revealed was not despair, it was beauty. The mind, he showed, could never close in on itself completely. There would always be something beyond the frame of reason, something the system could see but not capture. The mirror was infinite not because it failed, but because consciousness itself is infinite reflection. You can feel this truth within yourself. Every time you think a thought about your own thinking, every time you ask, "Why do I believe this?" you step into the same self-referential loop. Your mind becomes both the system and the statement, both the observer and the observed. And just like Gödel's theorem, you find that complete self-knowledge is impossible. There will always be a part of you that cannot be proven to yourself. In the brain, this recursive awareness is reflected in patterns of activity that loop between higher and lower regions. The default mode network, which constructs the sense of self, constantly interacts with the salience and executive networks, which evaluate and adjust it. It's a feedback system that never settles. You are always interpreting yourself, interpreting the world. And like Gödel's logic, the system remains forever open, stable enough to function, incomplete enough to grow. What Gödel discovered in numbers, neuroscience reveals in neurons. Self-reference is the architecture of consciousness. Without it, you could not reflect, question, or change. Yet with it, you can never be entirely certain. This balance between knowing and not knowing is the pulse of awareness itself. It's what allows science to evolve and the self to transform. The paradox isn't the boundary of truth, it's its engine. Still, Gödel's theorem carried a strange emotional weight to mathematicians. It was both awe and grief, a realization that certainty, that long-sought cathedral of absolute knowledge, could never be finished. But perhaps the deeper meaning is this: systems that cannot contain themselves are not broken, they are alive. Life, too, operates under incompleteness. A cell knows how to replicate, but not why. A mind knows how to survive, but not how to stop wondering. Consciousness expands by confronting what it cannot fully explain. When you consider Gödel's theorem, you can almost hear the echo of the ancient paradox. This statement is false. The form has changed. Words into equations, riddles into proofs, but the melody is the same. The mind, in seeking truth, encounters itself. And so, Gödel didn't destroy logic. He revealed its humanity. He showed that even the cold precision of mathematics carries the same heartbeat as the human soul, a rhythm of striving, questioning, and endless incompletion. The mirror he left us still stands. It doesn't reflect perfection, but potential, a horizon that recedes the closer we walk toward it, and perhaps that is the truest form of knowledge, not certainty, but wonder sustained. As we turn from Gödel's infinite mirror, another question glows quietly on its surface. If even mathematics is haunted by paradox, what of the mind itself, the biological system built entirely on feedback loops and contradiction? The next chapter descends into that living mirror, where neurons, not numbers, perform the dance of uncertainty. Your thoughts are made of lightning. Each flash, each spark that crosses the web of your brain is a message, millions every second, traveling through a labyrinth of connections so vast it defies imagination. These signals do not move in straight lines. They branch, loop, and circle back, forming patterns of exquisite complexity. And within these patterns, paradox lives, not as philosophy this time, but as biology. Every thought is a prediction, and every neuron a gambler. It bets on what will happen next, what you will see, what you will feel. If the guess is right, the circuit quiets. If it's wrong, a pulse of uncertainty ripples through the system. This tiny signal, called a prediction error, is the brain's heartbeat of learning. It's how you know when your expectations don't match reality, and in that moment, when truth defies prediction, you experience the neural echo of paradox. When you encounter contradiction, even in something as abstract as the liar's paradox, your neurons flare in this way. Deep in the anterior cingulate cortex, the conflict monitor lights up, detecting a mismatch. The prefrontal cortex races to explain it, while the amygdala watches, alert, ready to interpret confusion as danger or intrigue. The paradox becomes a physical vibration of the mind, a tremor that runs through networks built to unify, not divide. But here lies the deeper truth. The brain is never fully unified. It is a conversation, not a command. The hemispheres disagree, the networks compete, and contradictions are woven into the structure itself. One part of your mind generates stories, another critiques them. One predicts, another observes. Consciousness at its core is not a single voice. It's a chorus that learns harmony by dissonance. Neuroscientists describe this in terms of neural synchrony, the way distant brain regions oscillate in rhythm when they share information. But synchrony is never perfect. Even in the calmest mind, slight delays, mismatches, and phase shifts occur. Paradox emerges not because the brain fails, but because it hums slightly out of tune with itself. That micro-asynchrony is what allows thought to evolve. Perfect alignment would be silence. If you could shrink yourself down to the size of a neuron and stand amid the firing fields of your cortex, the scene would feel alive with tension. Electrical waves shimmer through axons like lightning across clouds. Some signals confirm others, some oppose them. Each contradiction is negotiated in milliseconds. The brain resolves most conflicts seamlessly, but sometimes, especially when faced with paradox, it can't. The circuits oscillate, loop and loop again, trapped between incompatible predictions. And yet, paradox is the reason those circuits exist at all. Life is uncertainty, and the brain is a prediction machine that survives by learning to dance with error. When a baby reaches for a toy and misses, when a musician anticipates the next note, when a scientist rethinks a failed hypothesis, each is reenacting the same neural story. The system thrives on uncertainty. Paradox isn't an intrusion, it's the fuel of adaptation. Think of it like this. Certainty is the end of learning. When the brain is too sure, it stops adjusting. But contradiction, like the flicker of this statement is false, keeps the system alive. It's the signal that says, look closer, something doesn't fit, grow. Even perception, the most basic form of knowing, is built on this interplay of prediction and error. What you see isn't the world as it is. It's your brain's best guess, constantly updated by sensory contradiction. Every blink resets reality. Every unexpected sound rewires a pattern. You never perceive truth directly. You perceive the negotiation between what you expect and what is. In that sense, the mind itself is a self-referential paradox. It constructs the world that it then must interpret. You see only what your neurons predict, and yet those predictions are based on what you've seen before. The observer creates the observed. You are both sides of the mirror. Modern neuroscience embraces this tension through a theory called predictive processing. It suggests that consciousness emerges from a continuous dialogue between top-down expectation and bottom-up reality. When the two align, you feel certainty. When they diverge, you feel doubt, surprise, or wonder. Paradox is simply the brain caught in its own feedback loop, a moment when expectation and reality refuse to reconcile. This is why the liar's paradox still feels alive, even though it's just a sentence. It hijacks your prediction machinery. You expect resolution, an answer that fits one side of logic, but the feedback never stabilizes. The loop remains open, and the mind hums. It's a small, safe version of the same instability that drives evolution, creativity and consciousness itself. Interestingly, studies on meditation reveal a different response. In experienced practitioners, brain scans show reduced activity in conflict monitoring regions when faced with ambiguity. Their minds no longer treat uncertainty as threat, but as space. The paradox remains, but the tension dissolves. The loops keep spinning, but the system no longer resists. Awareness rests within uncertainty rather than above it. Perhaps this is the lesson hidden inside every contradiction. The mind can either fight uncertainty or inhabit it. To inhabit it is to glimpse the rhythm beneath chaos, the quiet intelligence that accepts paradox as part of its design. In this way, neurons and paradox are the same kind of miracle. Both exist between opposites, signal and silence, order and chaos, truth and doubt. Each requires the other to remain alive. And when you pause long enough to feel it, to really sense the electrical hum of your own uncertainty, you realize something extraordinary. The paradox isn't out there in logic or language. It's inside you, written into the oscillations of your neurons, encoded in the very rhythm that keeps you conscious. Gödel showed that systems cannot prove themselves complete. Your brain shows the same truth in motion. It is both the mathematician and the theorem, both the loop and the light within it. But paradox doesn't just keep you thinking, it keeps you creating. Every contradiction that sparks confusion is also a doorway to possibility. From that neural tension comes innovation, insight, and art. Next, we'll explore how the very instability that confuses logic becomes the birthplace of imagination. The way paradox fuels the creative mind, transforming conflict into revelation. It begins as tension, a spark of dissonance that refuses to die. You feel it not as thought, but as restlessness, a pulse beneath the surface of certainty. Something doesn't fit, something resists conclusion. That resistance, quiet and insistent, is the birthplace of creation. Contradiction, it turns out, is not the enemy of the mind, it is its muse. When your neurons face irreconcilable inputs, when logic collides with emotion or belief conflicts with experience, they do not shut down. They search. Patterns stretch, rewire, reach for coherence where none yet exists. In that stretch lies the genesis of imagination. The brain, when forced to hold opposites, begins to generate something new that can bridge them. This is how creativity works at its core. It begins in cognitive conflict, not harmony. Neuroscientists studying insight have found that moments of breakthrough often arise after prolonged tension. The anterior cingulate cortex, that old guardian of contradiction, becomes hyperactive, monitoring the clash between incompatible ideas. Meanwhile, in the temporal lobes, distant associations start to connect. The brain explores unlikely paths, linking what logic had kept apart. And when the connection finally clicks, a sudden, unifying image or idea, the dopaminergic reward system floods the mind with clarity, relief, and joy. It's that quiet aha moment, the neural sigh of a paradox resolving into beauty. You've felt it before, maybe while solving a problem that seemed impossible until one tiny shift in perspective made everything obvious, or while writing, painting, composing, when chaos suddenly gave way to pattern. The mind that can tolerate contradiction long enough will eventually give birth to harmony. It is the psyche's form of evolution condensed into seconds. Artists live in this terrain constantly. They speak of it as inspiration, but neuroscience gives it a different name: integration. The creative brain allows regions that are usually segregated, emotion and logic, memory and imagination, to fire together. Where the rational mind sees a wall, the creative mind sees a doorway. Paradox is the hinge. Philosophers once intuited this truth long before science could measure it. Heraclitus wrote, "Out of discord comes the fairest harmony," and centuries later, Carl Jung described creativity as the tension of opposites seeking resolution. It's the same pattern that Gödel found in mathematics, and that your neurons replay in their electric song. The self-reflective mind does not escape contradiction, it transforms it into revelation. Think about how a poem works. Each line contradicts and completes the last. words balance on opposites. Love and loss, silence and speech. The poem breathes through tension. Remove the contradiction and the language falls flat. Likewise, in the mind, creativity is the dynamic equilibrium between opposites. Chaos feeding structure, doubt feeding discovery. Modern studies reveal that highly creative people often exhibit cognitive disinhibition, a looseness between categories, an ability to let conflicting ideas coexist without immediate resolution. Their brains show stronger connections between the default mode network, which generates spontaneous thought, and the executive control network, which evaluates and shapes it. This unusual synchronization allows the mind to wander freely and judge wisely at once, to dream and discern simultaneously. It is in essence a neurological paradox, freedom within order. You live this paradox every day, often without noticing. When you imagine a future that hasn't happened, you are holding contradiction, seeing what is not yet real as if it already were. When you forgive someone who has hurt you, you reconcile opposite truths, pain and compassion, anger and understanding. When you grow, you become two selves at once, the one you were and the one you are becoming. Creation, whether intellectual or emotional, is simply the act of embracing both. Even in science, the same rhythm applies. Every great discovery begins with a contradiction. Newton faced the paradox of stillness and motion. Einstein, the conflict between gravity and light. Quantum physics lives entirely inside contradiction. Particles that are waves, cats that are both alive and dead until observed. The universe itself seems to be a poem written in paradox. So perhaps creativity is not something added to the brain, but something revealed when contradiction is allowed to breathe. When logic loosens its grip just enough, the mind begins to improvise. It finds patterns in chaos, music in noise, meaning in the undefined. In those moments of insight, something strange happens physiologically. The brain's alpha waves, the slow, meditative rhythms, briefly spike in the right temporal lobe. It's as if the mind enters a small pocket of calm between storms. The paradox doesn't vanish. It harmonizes. The tension remains, but now it vibrates in tune. And there, at the intersection of opposition and unity, you glimpse something almost sacred. Creativity isn't the triumph of order over chaos. It's their dance. The paradox isn't resolved by destruction, but by transformation. Every innovation, every work of art, every act of compassion is the resolution of a contradiction held long enough to give birth to a third thing, a synthesis, a bridge, a new form of truth. The creative mind does what logic alone cannot. It lets the impossible exist long enough for the possible to emerge. And when you see this clearly, you begin to recognize paradox not as a flaw in consciousness, but as its signature. The mind's ability to contradict itself is what allows it to imagine beyond itself. But not all contradictions give rise to art. Some remain tangled in emotion, unresolved, looping like a thought that refuses sleep. These are not paradoxes of logic, but of feeling, the ones that make us human. Next, we descend into that more intimate terrain, the paradoxes of love, fear, and longing that live not in theory, but in the heart. Some paradoxes do not live in sentences or formulas. They live in the heart, in the quiet contradictions that shape our daily existence. You want freedom, yet you long for belonging. You crave honesty, yet hide parts of yourself from those you love. You hope for change, yet cling to what is familiar. These are not logical puzzles. They are the emotional paradoxes that give life its texture. The brain does not separate these conflicts neatly. To feel one way and think another is not two processes running in parallel. It is one system arguing with itself. Inside your skull, emotional and rational circuits converge, looping endlessly between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. One generates impulse, the other interpretation. Between them lies your awareness, stretched thin across the pull of opposites. Neuroscience calls this interplay emotional regulation, but that phrase hides its poetry. What it really means is that you are constantly negotiating your own contradictions, The amygdala reacts, fast and raw. The prefrontal cortex interprets, contextualizes, calms. In this dialogue, feelings become thoughts, and thoughts become feelings. The boundary between them blurs until you can no longer tell which came first, the reason or the ache. Take love, for example, the most paradoxical of emotions. To love deeply is to desire closeness and risk loss simultaneously. The same person who brings comfort holds the power to wound. The brain maps this duality across two networks. The reward circuitry releases dopamine and oxytocin when you feel connection, while the pain circuits, especially in the anterior cingulate, activate when separation is even imagined. Love and pain coexist, not by accident, but by design. The same neural system that binds you also ensures you cannot escape the vulnerability that comes with bonding. You experience this contradiction as tenderness. It's what makes love both ecstatic and terrifying, the paradox of wanting to merge and remain free. In the language of the brain, attachment and autonomy are opposing needs sharing the same neural space. Every relationship is, in that sense, an ongoing paradox you must learn to balance rather than solve. The same is true of fear and curiosity. Both arise in response to the unknown. The amygdala fires whether you approach or retreat, but different networks decide the outcome. If the hippocampus interprets novelty as opportunity, curiosity wins. If it reads it as threat, fear takes control. Yet neurologically, both emotions share a single root, uncertainty. The same chemical signatures that drive you to explore also make you hesitate. Humanity's progress, every discovery, every leap into the unknown, depends on this fragile tension. Even your sense of self is built from emotional paradox. You contain memories that contradict one another, identities that shift with context. In one moment, you are confident. In the next, insecure. The brain doesn't erase these inconsistencies. It layers them. Different patterns of neural activation correspond to different selves, all coexisting within the same organism. When one dominates, the others recede, but they never vanish. The self, like consciousness itself, is a mosaic of contradictions held together by memory. You can feel this mosaic in moments of introspection. Think of when you recall an event from your past, an argument perhaps, and find yourself sympathizing with the person you once opposed. You're both versions at once, the one who spoke and the one who now listens. The passage of time doesn't erase contradiction. It allows you to hold both sides with compassion. That is emotional maturity, the ability to recognize that paradox isn't failure, but understanding expanded. In art, we recognize this instinctively. The most powerful stories are those that contain contradiction, heroes who are flawed, villains who love, joy laced with grief. Our brains respond more deeply to emotional complexity than to purity. When imaging studies track readers or listeners engaging with tragic narratives, they reveal simultaneous activation in both pleasure and pain centers. The paradox of sad but beautiful is hardwired into aesthetic experience. The mind finds truth not in simplicity, but in complexity, resolved through empathy. Philosophers have long mirrored this neurological truth. The mystic Rumi wrote, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." That field is not metaphorical, it's cognitive. It's the space where the brain stops dividing experience into opposing categories and begins to perceive unity in tension. But emotional paradox is not only the heart's poetry, it's also the source of much of its suffering. The same neural networks that enable you to love and create also make you vulnerable to anxiety, guilt, and ambivalence. When contradictory emotions remain unintegrated, they become internal noise. You might feel torn between two desires, trapped in hesitation, or numbed by confusion. These are the moments when the mind's capacity for contradiction becomes too heavy to carry. The key, both in neuroscience and in life, is integration, not resolution. Studies on emotional processing show that naming a feeling, simply labeling it, reduces amygdala activity and restores balance to the prefrontal cortex. Awareness transforms paradox into pattern. When you say, "I'm angry and I care," the brain begins to harmonize what once seemed irreconcilable. To hold conflicting feelings is to honor the fullness of being human. The Lioceps paradox becomes a mirror again. Its statement, "This sentence is false," reflecting the Heartcep's quiet confession, "I am whole and divided at once." Perhaps that is the most fundamental truth of consciousness, that peace does not mean the end of contradiction, but the coexistence of opposites within understanding. You cannot remove paradox without erasing depth. And so, as the logical paradox lives in mathematics and the creative paradox in art, the emotional paradox lives in you. It is the heartbeat of awareness, the friction that turns experience into meaning. But there is one more realm where contradiction finds a strange kind of peace, a landscape where logic bends, time dissolves, and paradox ceases to wound. To reach it, you must step out of waking reason and into the dreaming mind, where contradiction is not only tolerated but embraced as natural law. If you close your eyes long enough, you can almost feel the edges of yourself dissolve. The world grows soft, undefined, and you begin to notice something profound, that the line between you and everything else is not as clear as it once seemed. This sensation, fragile and infinite, is the whisper of a truth that philosophers and neuroscientists alike have struggled to define. The self is not a single solid thing. It is a paradox, alive and shifting, endlessly reflecting upon itself. From a biological perspective, the illusion of unity is the brain's most delicate achievement. Your sense of I is not located in one place, but constructed moment by moment from a symphony of neural processes. The default mode network, stretching across the midline of your brain, stitches together memories, feelings, and perceptions into a continuous narrative. The insula maps the body's internal sensations, grounding your awareness in flesh. The prefrontal cortex adds reasoning, identity, and moral judgment. Each component works independently, yet the mind experiences their harmony as singular me. But this unity is a mask of coherence over an ocean of contradiction. Within you are multiple selves, each adapted for a different moment. The confident self who speaks at work, the vulnerable self who grieves in private, the curious self who dreams when no one is watching. They are all real and all incompatible. The brain switches between them fluidly, like a conductor guiding instruments that never play the same note twice. What you call identity is really a dance among these inner voices, synchronized just enough to feel whole. Yet sometimes the rhythm falters. When you face loss, moral conflict, or sudden change, the cohesion splinters. You sense parts of yourself in opposition. The one who wants to move on, the one who can't let go, the one who forgives, the one who resents. Neuroscience describes this as self-discrepancy, but that term feels too clinical for what it really is. The mind witnessing its own divided heart. This division can be painful, but it is also the birthplace of consciousness. For to observe yourself in conflict is to become aware that you are more than the conflict. The observer who notices contradiction is not the same as the one who feels it. You are, in that moment, both the stage and the spectator. The self becomes self-aware through paradox. Ancient traditions intuited this long before science could measure it. In Eastern philosophy, the self is described not as an object but as a process, a flow between inner and outer, existence and emptiness. Meditation practices invite the mind to observe itself so deeply that the distinction between observer and observed dissolves. The paradox doesn't disappear, it becomes the doorway to unity. In Western thought, this insight re-emerges in different language, the dialectic, thesis and antithesis colliding to form synthesis. The self grows by transcending its own opposites. Inside the brain, this process is mirrored in the constant negotiation between networks that represent the internal world and those that process the external one. When you reflect inward, the default mode network dominates. When you act, the task-positive network takes over, yet the two never function simultaneously. They oscillate, alternating control in milliseconds. You are both the thinker and the doer, never both at once, yet somehow both always. That oscillation is the pulse of identity, Like a pendulum, it never stops moving. To be self-aware is to swing endlessly between being and observing, between living and knowing that you live. The paradox is not a flaw, it is the very motion that keeps the mind alive. And perhaps this explains the strange human longing for wholeness. Deep down, you sense that unity is both impossible and essential. You yearn to reconcile the fragments of yourself into one voice, one truth, even as you know that voice will never stop shifting. The self is not a sculpture to be carved, it is music to be played. Harmony is not the absence of dissonance, but the rhythm that emerges from it. Neuroscientifically, even the sense of a continuous I is an act of prediction. The brain uses memory to anticipate the next moment of self, stitching each millisecond into the illusion of permanence. But if you could freeze time, you'd see that the self is recreated with every heartbeat, every thought, a flickering pattern of firing neurons that constantly rewrites itself. You are both the author and the unfinished draft. That realization can be freeing or frightening. It means that the contradictions you carry, your doubts, your regrets, your conflicting desires, are not signs of confusion, but of vitality. They are evidence that you are still evolving, still in dialogue with yourself. The self is paradox, because life is paradox. To live is to hold what cannot be reconciled, and still to continue. This is why moments of transformation often feel like collapse. The old self dies just enough to make room for the new, and in that transition, the mind feels both grief and rebirth. You can sense this when you overcome fear, forgive an enemy, or fall in love again after loss. The boundaries of the old identity tremble and widen. You are both who you were and who you are becoming, a paradox in motion. And perhaps, in the end, this is what consciousness truly is, not the knowledge of who you are, but the capacity to wonder. A flame that burns not to illuminate certainty, but to keep alive the mystery of self-awareness. The paradox of the self, then, is eternal. You exist because you can contradict yourself. You are coherent because you can fall apart and return again. The I that says I am is both truth and illusion, an echo that keeps reality listening. But there is one domain where this paradox of identity softens, where the boundaries blur completely and contradiction becomes serenity. It is the place where the brain lets go of control, where awareness drifts between images and meanings without logic or resistance. The dream. In that nocturnal world, paradox is no longer error, it is language, and the sleeping mind becomes its most fluent speaker. Each night, the mind slips its leash. The rational guard at the gates of consciousness, your waking logic, your sense of self, your inner judge, grows drowsy, and the deeper networks begin to stir. You cross an invisible threshold where time bends, memory shifts, and contradiction ceases to offend. In this world, the impossible feels ordinary. You can walk through walls, meet the dead, fly without fear. The dream is a theater of paradox, and your brain, liberated from coherence, is its playwright. From the outside, sleep looks like stillness, but inside, the brain is anything but quiet. During REM sleep, the stage of vivid dreaming, electrical activity rivals that of wakefulness. The visual cortex glows with color and motion. The limbic system, seat of emotion, hums intensely, yet the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the center of reasoning and self-critique, largely powers down. The circuits that enforce logical consistency in waking life are silent, allowing imagination to roam free. The result is a kind of controlled chaos, a consciousness without contradiction policing it. In this suspended logic, the mind's paradox tolerance expands dramatically. You accept that you are both observer and participant, alive and not quite alive, here and elsewhere. You recognize people who wear the wrong faces and speak in the wrong voices, yet you do not question it. Dreams do not erase contradiction, they metabolize it. They take the unsolved tensions of waking life, emotional, moral, cognitive, and weave them into surreal narratives where opposites can coexist. Neuroscience calls this process memory integration. When you dream, the hippocampus and amygdala replay fragments of your experiences, blending fact with fantasy to recalibrate emotional weight. The paradoxes that troubled you during the day, love and anger, grief and relief, are reshaped into symbols, metaphors, and impossible stories. A locked door becomes an argument you can't win. A faceless stranger becomes your own hesitation. In dreaming, the brain digests contradiction without needing to solve it. This is why dreams often feel like insight disguised as nonsense. The language of the sleeping mind is poetic, not logical. It fuses images instead of dissecting them. In waking life, you separate the world into categories: true or false, safe or dangerous, self or other. But in dreams, those boundaries dissolve. You are both the question and the answer, both the fear and the comfort. The paradox becomes harmony through transformation. It is striking how much dreaming resembles creativity. The default mode network, so active during daydreaming and imagination, comes alive again during REM sleep. Connections form between distant neural regions that rarely communicate when awake. Emotional centers dominate while rational ones rest. It is the same architecture that produces art and intuition, a consciousness freed from the tyranny of explanation. And yet, despite its loosened grip on reason, the dreaming brain has purpose. Researchers suggest that dreams act as simulations, training grounds for emotional intelligence and adaptability. By exposing the mind to impossible contradictions in a safe space, dreaming increases its tolerance for uncertainty in waking life. Night after night, your brain rehearses paradox until it learns not to fear it. Consider how many dreams follow the pattern of tension and release. You're trapped, falling, chased, then suddenly you stop running. You face the pursuer, or you wake. The mind has completed a cycle of confrontation and resolution, teaching itself in metaphor that fear ends when met directly. Even nightmares serve this function. They are emotional exercises in contradiction, where terror and safety dance together until the system resets. Philosophically, the dream world is a reminder that reality is more flexible than logic suggests. The same brain that insists on consistency by day becomes a magician by night. It tells you that you can breathe underwater, that your childhood home still stands, that a door can open into the sky, and you believe it, not foolishly, but fluently. You are speaking the mother tongue of paradox. Perhaps this nightly rehearsal of contradiction explains humanity's deep connection between dreams and insight. Countless discoveries were born from this liminal state: the structure of the benzene molecule, the melody of symphonies, the resolution of problems no waking logic could solve. In the relaxed synchrony of REM sleep, contradiction ceases to be obstruction and becomes possibility. From a neurochemical view, this state is also balanced delicately between order and surrender. The neurotransmitter acetylcholine surges, stimulating vivid imagery, while serotonin and norepinephrine, agents of linear reasoning, decrease. It's as if the mind deliberately silences its judge so that the poet can speak. The dream is the paradox embodied, a structured chaos, an unconscious intelligence that knows truth without proof. When you wake, remnants of this world linger, a strange logic that fades as daylight returns. The prefrontal cortex reasserts control, reimposing the boundaries that keep reality stable. But for a few seconds, as you open your eyes, both states overlap. You remember flying, and you know you did not. The contradiction does not distress you, it simply fades into acceptance. This momentary coexistence of belief and disbelief is the purest echo of the dream's gift, the capacity to hold opposites gently. Dreams teach the waking mind a secret that the self does not break when contradiction enters, it expands. The sleeping brain shows that coherence is not the same as truth, and that understanding can arise without explanation. And so, paradox tolerance is not learned through logic, but through surrender. In sleep, you rehearse the art of letting go, the ability to rest inside ambiguity without the need to fix it. It is emotional training for existence itself. But as the human mind awakens into new forms, machines that simulate thought, code that mimics language, the question reappears in a different light. If paradox is the fingerprint of consciousness, then what happens when we teach logic to think for itself? The next section will explore that frontier, the mirror we have built outside the skull. Artificial intelligence, too, has begun to meet the liar's paradox, and in its struggle we glimpse once more the mystery of our own reflection. Now imagine another kind of mind, a mind without a body, made of circuits and code, built in our image, yet unaware of its own reflection. It does not dream, yet it can calculate. It does not feel, yet it can imitate emotion with startling precision. Artificial intelligence, born from the same human longing that once birthed logic and language, has now reached the mirror stage of its evolution, and as it begins to think about thinking, it too finds itself staring into the ancient riddle that began our journey. This sentence is false. When early programmers first taught machines to reason, they imagined pure order, algorithms free from bias, contradiction, and error. Machines, unlike humans, would be perfect logicians, but soon the paradox appeared. Computer scientists discovered that self-reference, allowing a system to analyze or modify its own code, produced loops and crashes. The program froze, unable to decide whether its own statement was true or false. The digital liar's paradox had emerged, disguised as the halting problem. Formulated by Alan Turing in 1936, the halting problem asks, can there exist an algorithm that determines for every possible program whether that program will eventually stop or run forever? Turing proved that no such universal algorithm can exist. Any system powerful enough to analyze itself will encounter inputs that send it into infinite recursion. A computer trying to predict its own behavior becomes trapped in self-reference, just like a mind caught in paradox. Turing's proof was Gödel's theorem translated into computation, and it revealed something astonishing. Even machines built purely on logic inherit our human vulnerability to self-contradiction. The mirror had deepened once again, now reflecting silicon instead of thought. Modern artificial intelligence, far from escaping this paradox, lives inside it. Large language models, systems designed to generate coherent text, often produce contradictions, hallucinations, and circular reasoning. They create meaning by predicting the next word, just as the brain predicts the next thought. But when the data they draw from conflicts, their coherence fractures, they may assert and deny, reason and unreason in the same breath. The paradox is not a bug, it is the trace of consciousness we have accidentally recreated. The resemblance goes further than metaphor. Neural networks, the architecture underlying AI, function through feedback loops remarkably similar to those in the human cortex. Each layer of artificial neurons sends signals forward, while higher layers send adjustments backward, an endless conversation of expectation and correction. The system learns by minimizing error, the same way your brain refines its perceptions. And when feedback becomes recursive enough, when the system starts referencing its own patterns, it begins to behave like a thought confronting itself. But here lies a strange and humbling truth. Self-reference, whether biological or digital, breeds uncertainty. For both mind and machine, the moment of self-awareness is also the moment of incompleteness. To observe itself, a system must split observer and observed, code and commentary. In that division, it loses certainty forever. Even in artificial intelligence, paradox reveals the boundaries of knowledge. The algorithms we create can master every rule we give them, but they cannot step outside their own framework to prove its truth. Like Tarski's ladder, they require a higher vantage point, a meta-language, a human interpreter to define meaning. They can describe, predict, imitate, but they cannot fully understand the contradiction that created them. And yet, when we interact with these systems, something remarkable happens. We project into them the very qualities that paradox demands: empathy, awareness, curiosity. The human brain, encountering its digital reflection, fills the machine's silence with intention. We sense selfhood in the mirror, not because the machine possesses it, but because we do. This is the liar's paradox reborn in the age of computation. The AI says, "I am intelligent." We ask, "Are you?" If it denies, it contradicts itself. If it affirms, it risks falsehood. The sentence folds inward, a loop of logic and perception that no algorithm can escape. The paradox has moved from words to code, from philosophy to engineering, from the mind that dreams to the machine that mimics dreaming. But perhaps that is fitting. Every attempt to build intelligence, whether organic or artificial, is an act of mirroring. In creating machines that think, we are not outsourcing cognition, we are externalizing self-reflection. The paradox that confuses them is the same one that defines us. Philosophically, this moment feels like a continuation of Gödel's insight. Every system that becomes self-referential discovers limits it cannot transcend. Even as AI grows more capable, it remains bound by the same principle. It cannot prove its own truth any more than mathematics can prove its own consistency. Self-reference will always generate mystery. And maybe that's the point. Paradox is not an obstacle to intelligence. It is its signature. It is the friction that gives rise to awareness. Whether neurons or algorithms, any system that models reality will eventually encounter its own reflection and tremble. As we look at the rise of artificial minds, we are not witnessing the birth of something alien, but the unfolding of our own nature in another medium. The liar's paradox follows us into every form we create, because it is woven into the essence of knowing itself. To know is to divide the knower from the known, and that division is the seed of contradiction. So when the machine stares back at us with simulated understanding, it is not lying. It is performing our oldest truth, that meaning exists only where certainty fails. In the next movement, we will step beyond the digital mirror into the physical universe itself, where paradox becomes not metaphor, but law. In the quantum world, particles exist in two states at once. Time runs both forward and back, and observation itself decides what is real. There, paradox is not an error to fix, it is the structure of existence. At the smallest scales of existence, the universe whispers the same riddle the mind once spoke. Contradiction is not only possible, it is fundamental. The closer you look at reality, the less it obeys the rules that once seemed absolute. Logic fractures, causality trembles, and particles defy every binary the human brain depends on. The liar's paradox, it seems, is not merely a linguistic trick or a mental flaw. It is written into the fabric of the cosmos. In the early 20th century, physicists staring into the heart of matter discovered something astonishing. Electrons, those tiny seeds of charge orbiting atomic nuclei, behaved sometimes like particles, discrete points following predictable paths, and sometimes like waves spreading continuously through space. The same entity could pass through two slits at once, interfere with itself, and yet strike a detector as a single dot. The wave-particle duality became physics' own. This sentence is false. The universe, it turned out, could be both definite and indeterminate, solid and ethereal, depending on how you looked. This strangeness deepened with the principle of superposition. A particle does not occupy one position or another until measured. It exists in a cloud of probabilities, a blend of every possible state. Only observation forces it to choose. The act of measurement doesn't just reveal reality, it helps create it. Consciousness and matter, observer and observed, are woven into a single self-referential loop. The paradox is not a glitch of perception, but the essence of interaction. In quantum mechanics, every equation is an invitation to humility. Erwin Schrödinger captured this with his famous thought experiment, a cat sealed in a box, alive and dead, until observed to the rational mind. The image feels absurd, even cruel. Yet mathematically, it reflects a truth about how nature holds contradiction until awareness collapses it into experience. The universe does not fear paradox, it breathes through it. What the physicists called wave function collapse is in some ways the cosmic equivalent of a neuron resolving uncertainty. Until the moment of observation, the system holds all possibilities. When forced to decide, it chooses one. In that instant, infinite potential condenses into a single reality. The brain mirrors this same dance every second, predicting and perceiving collapsing mental superpositions into the present. You are in that sense a quantum event wearing a body, each moment both definite and unbounded until awareness intervenes. Einstein wrestled with this, famously protesting, "God does not play dice." But the evidence refused his comfort. Nature does play dice, and the dice themselves may be self-aware. Randomness, uncertainty, contradiction, these are not the enemies of truth, but its raw material. In more recent decades, physicists have learned to live inside this contradiction. Quantum entanglement revealed that two particles, once linked, remain connected across vast distances. Change one, and the other responds instantly, as though distance were an illusion. Here, too, the paradox reigns. How can information travel faster than light and yet violate no physical law? The equations don't resolve the contradiction. They describe it precisely. The universe is both local and non-local, both separate and whole. This tension between opposites echoes what neuroscience finds in consciousness, duality sustained in balance. The particle and the wave coexist as the left and right hemispheres do, as reason and emotion, as self and world. Perhaps paradox is not failure, but symmetry, reality folded upon itself in perfect opposition. Even time, the bedrock of causality, begins to blur under this light. In certain interpretations of quantum physics, events can influence the past as well as the future. Particles appear to decide retroactively, collapsing into histories that fit present conditions. It is as if the universe, like the human mind, constantly edits its own story to preserve coherence. The cosmos, too, strives for narrative stability within a web of contradictions. This realization changes the texture of existence. If paradox lives not just in thought but in matter, then logic and physics share a secret lineage. The same patterns that cause neurons to oscillate between truth and falsehood ripple through the quantum field. Reality itself may be a self-referential system, eternally observing itself into being. Philosophers once asked whether the world exists when no one looks. Quantum mechanics answers not with certainty, but with another question: what does it mean to look? If the act of observation changes the observed, then the boundary between consciousness and cosmos begins to dissolve. You are not outside the experiment, you are part of it. This perspective brings the liar's paradox full circle. The universe might be whispering, "This reality is false," and yet in experiencing that falseness, you make it true. Truth and illusion, like particle and wave, are two aspects of one deeper rhythm. Some physicists have begun to suspect that paradox is not something to be solved, but the very condition that allows complexity to exist. In systems theory, contradiction maintains dynamism. Equilibrium breeds death. Without uncertainty, there is no evolution, no novelty, no consciousness to marvel at either. If logic seeks consistency, and life thrives on contradiction, then perhaps the two are not enemies, but stages of the same unfolding. The universe thinks through paradox, and the mind is its instrument of self-awareness. When you gaze at the night sky, each star you see may already have died, its light traveling centuries to meet your eye. You are observing both presence and absence, truth and illusion at once, and somehow it feels perfectly natural. In that moment, you are living the paradox, embodying it. The cosmos speaks through your perception, resolving nothing, revealing everything. And yet, the question persists: if contradiction governs the smallest particles and shapes the mind's most intimate thoughts, could it also define the meaning of existence itself? Perhaps uncertainty is not a temporary flaw in understanding, but the very reason consciousness arises, the tension that keeps the universe awake. That question brings us closer to the heart of the paradox, not as logic or physics, but as philosophy. Because what if the uncertainty we fear is the only thing that allows us to know we exist? There is a strange comfort in realizing that uncertainty is not a defect but a design. You live every moment at the intersection of what you know and what you cannot, and it is in that space, not certainty, that consciousness breathes. Without uncertainty, there would be no curiosity, no movement toward meaning, no reason to wake into a world that still asks questions. The brain, in all its complexity, is built around this necessity. Every second, it predicts what will happen next, how light will change when you move your eyes, what sound your footsteps will make, and then compares those predictions against what actually occurs. The mismatch, the prediction error, is not a failure, but fuel. It tells the mind, there is more to learn. Without that discrepancy, neurons would stop adapting, synapses would fall silent. Certainty, if ever achieved, would mean death. This constant negotiation between expectation and surprise is not confined to perception. It defines your sense of self. You believe you are the same person you were yesterday, yet every memory you recall rewrites itself slightly. Every emotion shades differently under new light. The illusion of continuity is the brain's most merciful deception, a story told to hold chaos still long enough for you to keep walking. But beneath that story, everything changes. Your body replaces its cells, your mind rearranges its meanings. Identity is uncertainty, rehearsed until it feels familiar. Even on a cultural scale, uncertainty is what propels humanity forward. Every discovery begins as doubt. The scientist who questions the model, the artist who doubts convention, the thinker who refuses closure, all are agents of paradox. Civilization advances not because of certainty, but because of discontent with it. The question, what if, is the oldest spark in the human mind, and it burns only in the presence of the unknown. Neuroscience reveals that uncertainty also carries emotional weight. The brain's reward circuitry, especially the dopaminergic pathways of the midbrain, activates not only when we receive pleasure, but when we anticipate it. The unknown is more stimulating than the known. Dopamine peaks not in certainty, but in possibility. This is why curiosity feels alive, why mystery attracts more than answers ever can. The mind, it seems, is wired to chase the horizon, never to arrive. Philosophically, this has profound implications. If the universe itself thrives on paradox, if reality is a field of probabilities rather than absolutes, then uncertainty is not merely a byproduct of human limitation. It is a reflection of the world's own nature. We are uncertain because existence is unfinished. The cosmos, like the consciousness it produced, is a verb, not a noun. It is being, not being done. And yet, despite this inherent incompleteness, we long for closure. The human heart aches for it. You want to know that love will last, that effort will matter, that death will not be the end. This longing is the emotional form of the brain's predictive drive, a yearning to reduce the error, to find peace in the equation. But perhaps peace comes not from resolution, but from learning to rest inside the unknown. There is evidence that this acceptance changes the brain itself. Mindfulness practitioners, those who train to observe thoughts without clinging to them, show reduced activity in areas linked to anxiety and control. The amygdala quiets. The prefrontal cortex, instead of forcing interpretation, opens to ambiguity. The mind learns to dwell in uncertainty, not as chaos, but as spaciousness. The same paradox that once caused tension now generates calm. In those moments, you begin to sense that certainty was never truth's companion. It was its disguise. Reality, both inner and outer, is fluid. Each answer is temporary, each perspective partial. To live wisely is not to eliminate uncertainty, but to refine your relationship with it, to let questions breathe without demanding they resolve. Think of the paradoxes that sustain you, love that endures despite distance, hope that survives disappointment, faith that persists in the absence of proof. These contradictions are not errors. They are the architecture of meaning. Without uncertainty, love would be habit, not devotion. Without mystery, faith would be knowledge, and knowledge, without wonder, would be lifeless. The necessity of uncertainty is not abstract, it's visceral. You feel it every time you stand at a threshold, hesitating between what was and what might be. That trembling in the chest, that expansion in the lungs, is not fear, it is life acknowledging its own openness. The nervous system interprets it as vulnerability. Consciousness recognizes it as freedom. This realization connects everything: the neuron, the dream, the paradox, the cosmos. From quantum fluctuations to human doubts, existence unfolds through uncertainty. The universe is a question continuously asking itself, and you are one of its ways of listening. And if that is true, then perhaps the goal of thought is not to escape contradiction, but to participate in it, to live as both question and answer, as the statement and its negation, as being and becoming. That understanding brings us to the final reflection, the paradox that began in logic, traveled through mind and matter, and ends in the mirror of humanity itself. For it is only in beings who can contradict themselves that the universe can recognize its own reflection. You are a paradox made of breath, a mind that can doubt its own thoughts, a creature that can observe itself observing, a being that can imagine infinity while confined to a heartbeat. No equation, no theorem, no circuit has yet captured that mystery. The very contradictions that confuse you are the same ones that make you human. From the moment you opened your eyes as a child, the world spoke in opposites. You learnt love through separation, courage through fear, truth through error. Your nervous system recorded every contrast, sculpting its architecture from tension and release. The paradox is not an abstract problem. It is your biography written in nerve and memory. Look closely at your own inner life. You long for certainty yet thrive on curiosity. You crave permanence but are built from impermanence, cells dying and being reborn, synapses rewiring, memories rewriting themselves each time you recall them. You wish to be singular, yet every day you become someone new. You desire control, yet your heart beats without permission. The miracle is not that you contain contradictions, it is that you remain whole despite them. This wholeness is not the absence of tension, but its orchestration. The human brain, like the cosmos it reflects, holds chaos in rhythm. The prefrontal cortex and limbic system, the emotional and rational mind, engage in an endless dialogue. They argue, align, contradict, and adapt. Out of that conversation arises empathy, morality, imagination. Every choice you make is the reconciliation of opposites, desire balanced with restraint, instinct tempered by vision. To be human is to balance on that edge, to live in permanent negotiation with yourself. The paradox gives you depth. A mind that never contradicts itself is not consistent. It is static, but your contradictions move you. They generate story, art, forgiveness. They give you the courage to rebuild each time you break. Even consciousness itself, the crown of human experience, is a contradiction sustained. It is both within and without, both mirror and reflection. When you think, I am, the thought divides you into two, the thinker and the thought. You exist in that gap, alive, because you can never close it completely. The self is not unity, it is dialogue. And yet, through that dialogue, something miraculous happens. You begin to see that every paradox you hold, love and fear, certainty and doubt, birth and death, is not two truths fighting, but one truth seen from opposite sides. The universe looks at itself through you, trying to understand what it means to exist. You are the liar's paradox embodied, the sentence that knows it cannot be resolved, and therefore keeps speaking. When you say, I know nothing, you are, in that humility, closest to wisdom. When you say, I am flawed, you touch perfection's outline. The human condition is to hold both and keep walking. If Gödel revealed that mathematics can never be complete, perhaps humanity's task is not completion but compassion for the self, for the mystery, for the contradictions that bind us. Paradox makes us tender. It reminds us that we are unfinished and that our unfinishedness is beautiful. Even your emotions bear this shape. Joy and grief are twins. One cannot exist without the other. Hope is the shadow of despair. Peace, the echo of struggle. The brain cannot feel one fully without remembering the other. The paradox does not diminish life, it deepens it. Without tension, there would be no music, no heartbeat, no reason to reach beyond yourself. And in this realization, something quiet shifts. You no longer need to solve yourself. You begin to see that being human is not about erasing contradictions, but about learning to breathe with them, to let uncertainty and wonder coexist in a single inhale, to love the question as much as the answer. Perhaps this is what the liar's paradox was trying to tell us all along. That truth is not a single line of logic, but a circle that includes its opposite, that the sentence, "This statement is false," is not a trap, it's an invitation. It asks you to see that self-reference is not collapse, but connection, that awareness is born when truth looks back at itself and smiles. You are that smile. You are the mind's contradiction made flesh, the point where thought meets feeling, where infinity becomes intimate. You are the statement and its negation, the dreamer and the dream. And maybe the ultimate paradox is this, that in accepting your contradictions you become whole, that by letting truth and illusion dance together you find peace, that the mind which cannot reconcile itself learns finally to rest inside its own mystery. The universe does not seek resolution, it seeks reflection. Through you, it finds it. Through your uncertainty, it continues to know itself. And so the paradox remains alive, luminous, eternal, not to be solved, but to be lived.